Hello everybody. We are looking at a new section today, and this section is section 3, which is all about answering the question, or in band descriptor terms, we are looking at the category of task achievement. Now this first lecture is going to focus on identifying main trends, or looking for patterns in task 1 questions. It's going to be a fairly short lecture, so let's get started by looking at the band descriptors as usual. So, in the band descriptors, one of the requirements to achieve band 7 in task achievement is to present a clear overview of main trends, differences, or stages. Now, we will be looking at the overview in more detail in a later lecture. For now, we will focus on 2 questions related to this requirement. Firstly, should we focus on trends, differences, or stages? And secondly, how do we find these? How do we find these trends, differences, or stages? Well, it's important to look at a variety of task types. We'll begin by looking at identifying trends. Now, whether you write about trends, differences, or stages will depend on which type of question or graph that you are given. Graphs with a trend is where we're going to talk about trends, as you might expect, because it contains data plotted over a time period. In this case, months in 2014. Regardless of whether the graph is a bar chart, a line graph, a table, etc., if information is being measured against dates, it can be called a graph with a trend, in which case we are going to try and identify those trends. You can see differences too, but in graphs like this, particularly in the overview, you should be trying to focus primarily on the trends. Let's have a look at this here. Basically, identifying trends is about following the direction of the slopes. It's as easy as that, and I'm going to illustrate with some drawing on the graph here. So the UK's figure slopes upwards, as you can see, indicating an upward trend until July, but after July the figure slopes downwards, which indicates a downward trend. Australia's AC sales, their air conditioning sales, they experienced a reverse of this trend, going down and then up, again just following the slopes. So then in your overview, to address the requirement to identify main trends, you simply mention this. Whereas the number of air conditioning sales in the UK rose and then fell, Australia's units experienced the opposite trend. You're just identifying those main trends. It's very unlikely you'll need to worry about trends with maps or processes, so focus on those when talking about graphs with a trend. Let's have a look at differences, when we should pick out differences. Now the 2 charts to your left, we have a pie chart above and a bar chart below. When combined, these can be described as a comparative graph. In this case, of course, we're looking at charts, doesn't really matter. Because there are no units of time, we can't talk about any trends. There can't be any rises or falls, no jumps or slumps, no upward trends or downward trends. However, we can look for comparisons, and the comparisons are everywhere you look. We have more gas than solar power. We have more coal power than gas power. There's less wind than solar, coal and gas. So lots of different ways that we could talk about the differences. So how do you decide which comparisons to focus on with so many to pick from? And in other words, what are the key differences, the most important differences? Well, the answer here is that there are none. There are no key differences. But it makes more sense to talk about some differences than others. Here we want to focus on the most and the least of things. This also creates a logical opportunity for a complex sentence, improving our grammar score. You can see the example here. Whereas the majority of electricity is consumed by heating, the minority goes towards charging. If possible, find ways to group data together. We'll be looking at this in more detail in the lecture on overviews in the next section, but here's a quick example of that. Renewable energy sources make up far less of total electricity than non-renewable sources. So rather than solar and wind, we're saying renewable. Rather than gas and coal, we're saying non-renewable. Differences are also very important to pick out in maps. You can focus on the differences between the old city and the new city. Are there more shopping facilities? Are there fewer trees? Is the new map more modern or less modern? This is also true for processes. We can look at differences in the amount of equipment or the materials involved in each stage. Here's an example. The first stage involves 4 pieces of equipment and only 1 ingredient, while the reverse is true for the second stage. Now that example actually relates to this task here, this process. We can look at the differences in the process with the equipment and the number of elements that go into each part. But most of the time, when we're looking at processes, we want to think about stages. So discussing stages is perhaps the simplest of the overview requirements. And this requirement refers to this task here as well. So let's have a look at how to identify key stages. Basically, it's simply a matter of accurately counting the number of stages involved in the process. Sometimes the number of steps involved is unclear, such as in the case with cement production. It's not very clear whether crushing the limestone is 1 or 2 stages. But you may use terms like appears to be to avoid slipping into inaccuracy. For example, whereas cement production appears to be composed of 7 steps, concrete production only consists of 2. As long as you support these numbers in your detail paragraphs, for example, you say that mixing is the first stage and rotating is the second stage, it would not be right to label your information as inaccurate. So you are addressing task requirements appropriately and assuring accuracy, which we're going to talk about in more detail in a couple of lectures' time. But in the next lecture, we're going to focus on identifying information in the detail paragraphs.